Hello gamers, Power Heal here, and today we're going to be talking about how to evaluate gear in World of Warcraft Classic, mostly from the healing perspective, and then specifically as from the priest perspective, although I do think that this video will be useful for druids, and it'll still be useful for a paladin and shaman as well. There'll be some things in here that they can take away from it. So what do I really mean when we're talking about evaluating gear, right? Because if you're familiar with WoW Classic at all, you know that the game's kind of been theory crafted to death already, right? For DPS, we have BIS lists. For healers, we have BIS lists. And basically, for DPS, things are very set in stone. The objective is just reducing the boss health to 0. How you do that is doing the most damage in the shortest period of time, and how to calculate that is very easy to do for the most part. And not only has the actual BIS and Pre-Bis been determined for DPS, but the kind of like alternate setups have been determined as well. Like if you don't have certain items that are really strong, right, what to substitute in. A lot has been done to, promote a large understanding of how to play pretty much every DPS class in the game. And a lot has been done for healing as well. But healing, just by its very nature, is a lot more subjective, right? Because there's a lot more variables involved. It kind of depends on what type of run you're healing, what type of gear you have available, what type of consumes you're using. Are you using world buffs? Are you not? What is your composition, right? There's like a lot of variables that just make healing just a lot more complicated, right? And that in turn makes the gearing process a bit more complicated as well, especially when we're talking about kind of like, I would say, the mid-tier guilds, and kind of like the guilds that are like, there's going to be a wide band of both skill in them and in terms of like knowledge and everything like that, right? People on the higher end of the spectrum tend to have things figured out to some degree, but this video is going to be targeted at just kind of like healing in general, and helping you make gearing decisions for your guild, not necessarily just dictating to you, okay, this is what like the world #1 speedrunner uses. Okay, so something to keep in mind when we're doing this video. It might be a bit of a long one. I was going to add this video into a Pre-Bis or Molten Core Bis thing, but I decided it would be just better to do it separately, and that way if you guys just want to see my recommendations for Bis and Pre-Bis, that'll be like a shorter video and you don't have to watch this one. So if that's what you're looking for, that video will be coming out basically next. But yeah, if you want to know kind of like why I'm recommending the things I'm recommending, this would be a good video to sit down and watch. So basically, what I've done is I've just kind of like created some tools, you could think of them as, right, to help evaluate pieces, and just like ways that I think about evaluating them. And there's kind of like 3 main things here, and they have to do with intelligence, MP5, and plus healing, which are pretty much, and spirit as well, in a sense, it's incorporated in there. So it's basically like the relationship between all those stats and how to kind of like get a semblance of what the equivalency is in various scenarios, right? Because that's going to be a big thing when you're going to be looking at healer gear, is you want to be seeing like, okay, like, how much int is equal to this on this other item. Because in a lot of cases, you're getting an item in one case that has more plus healing, right? And then in other cases, another item's going to have more int, and you might be like, well, what's better, right? So this is an attempt at trying to break that down, and it's not going to be perfect because there's not really a way to do this and say like, this much intellect is always equivalent to like this much plus healing or something like that. It's just not possible because they're kind of like different entities, right? But we can like make some easy to understand tools that kind of help us with these comparisons, at least in some cases. And what I'm going to try and do is I'll point out the cases that these tools don't help as much, where they're kind of like weaker, and I'll point out the cases where they're kind of stronger and where you really should be using them, right? So the first one that I want to talk about is comparing intellect and mana per 5, right? And I find that this is really useful because they're on quite a bit of gear. You don't see MP5 quite as much in phase 1, but especially as more items start getting added to the game, it starts to pop up a lot. And I always hear questions from like guildmates and stuff like that. They'll always like link me these items, and they'll be like, "Oh, like which one of these is better?" And the reality is that it's very easy to tell which one is better in a lot of cases most of the time with just some simple math. So basically, mana per 5 is the amount of mana the item gives per a tick of 5, right? And what we'll say is that since there are 12 ticks of 5 in a minute, we can just think of this value in mana per minute, right? That's a much easier way to look at this, and will help us make comparisons a little bit easier. And then we'll look at intellect. It's 15 mana per point of intellect. So that one is also pretty straightforward, right? So basically, how you determine the equivalency between these is you basically look at how much mana you're getting from your intellect, right? And then you'll see how much mana per minute you're getting from a particular piece of MP5, right? So in other words, like let's say you have a choice between 2 rings. One gives 10 intellect and the other gives 5 MP5, right? So you would do 10 intellect is 15 mana per intellect, so it's 150 mana, right? And then 5 mana per 5 is, with 12 ticks, right, is 60 mana per minute. So you can then be like, okay, well, since the intellect gives me 150 mana and I get 60 mana per minute with the MP5, it's approximately 2 minutes, right, for my mana per 5 to give me the same equivalent value as the intelligence, okay? And that's pretty good for an encounter by encounter basis. So what do I mean by that, right? Well, that's basically like if you're doing a fight like a Lucifron or something and you start at full mana and you basically just start casting and the fight lasts approximately 1.5 to 2 minutes, right? That's going to give you a pretty good baseline of what intellect, like what that 10 intellect versus what that 10 or that 5 MP5 is going to do for you in that particular fight. However, it's really bad if you try and then extrapolate that to like the whole raid. Because, for example, you could say like, oh, well, my raid lasts 40 minutes or something like that, my Molten Core raid, so I can see how much mana per minute MP5 is giving me back for the whole raid. That kind of breaks down a bit unless you're doing something like a pure speedrunning scenario where you're always going to be lower than max mana, and therefore you're always gaining mana, right? So you can already start to see how these things kind of like can fall apart sometimes in a bit of the bigger picture. However, I still think this metric is fairly useful because for a lot of guilds, the point is just killing the boss, right? And most of the time you're kind of walking up to a boss, you're killing it, and you're drinking to full beforehand, you're killing the boss, and then you're drinking to full after and moving on. So it's being able to just calculate on a fight per fight basis what an item is doing for you is pretty good, and for most players, kind of like the star of these instances is going to be the actual boss encounters. It's not really until you get into kind of more speedrunning and trying to push the pace that people start to really care about the trash more, and people are going into fights not full mana and stuff like that. So for the majority of the player base, I feel like this is a fairly solid metric, and one that they can make great use of, right? The other thing about Int and MP5 when you look at them is there's this kind of like concept of having mana up front, right? And this isn't a way where I think Intellect tends to be superior to MP5 and for the same equivalence value. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say you have, again, same equivalence value, right? So 150 mana from Intellect, and then you have 150 mana that you get from 2 minutes, right, from having the mana per 5. So basically, you might think, oh, well, these are entirely equal, right? But what's actually going on is that with the 150 mana you get from Int, you have that mana all the time right up front, right? And that basically just gives you more flexibility because it allows you to decide when you want to use that mana at every step of the fight, right? Because when you have the MP5, you're not gaining that full 150 mana back until kind of like towards the very end of the fight. That's when you have most of it, right? But for Intellect, when you have it, you basically start the fight with that mana. So if you need to front load a bit more, cast more spells at the beginning, you have that luxury. Whereas with MP5, you're only getting the value back towards the tail end of the fight, right? And I think that's, generally speaking, a good way to look at it. Obviously, this kind of, it overlooks the fact that MP5 is constantly regenerating mana, even after you've left like a given fight, like a Lucifron or Magmadar or something like that, right? Whereas like for Intellect, in order for it to be fully useful in the next thing, you kind of have to like remax your mana, right? So obviously something like MP5 better for speedrunning scenarios. Intellect not so great there. But like I said, on a general boss per boss basis, you kind of get the idea. You can do the simple calculations, and I think especially as the game progresses, the focus tends to be more on bosses. This game has some annoying trash, but that's pretty much the limit it gets to. It's like annoying. Most people that are wiping in this game are not wiping on trash, right? Like they're not hard stuck on trash. They get stuck on bosses. So being able to calculate per boss, per specific encounter, always a good thing in my opinion. So moving on to the next thing here, which is Spirit versus MP5. So this is one that it's a lot more direct, or it seems a lot more direct at first, but there are some caveats, right? And the first one is that when you're comparing Spirit and MP5 in this way, most of the time what you're trying to compare is the effect that Spirit's giving you in combat versus, or not in combat necessarily, but while casting, because MP5 is giving you its MP5 always, which is while casting, right? So where this is going to be a weak metric is if you're trying to account for what Spirit's doing for you in a scenario where you're just like sitting down drinking, right? Because at that point you haven't casted, Spirit is acting on you, so it's giving you more regen. So Spirit is essentially more than what we're seeing here, and also there's obviously the talent in Holy that gives you spell damage and healing power based on the amount of Spirit you have. So this is not accounting for that either. So keep that in mind as we do these calculations. Spirit is not going to be necessarily as bad as it seems, but remember, this is for in combat or in while casting, chain casting specifically, right? So in order to do the equivalence here, we first look up the Spirit formula. And the Spirit formula is Spirit divided by 4 and plus 12.5, right? Now, we don't really care about the 12.5 because it's just a constant. We want to know the relationship of Spirit with to regen in our ticks. So we can just completely disregard 12.5. So basically, we're just looking at Spirit divided by 4 equals 1. So when we set it equal to 1, what we're saying is like for 1 tick. And in this particular case, a tick is 2 seconds. So MP5 ticks, they're 5-second ticks. The normal regen in the game is 2-second ticks, so keep that in mind. Now, you're going to think that that's going to be a problem to compare, but we'll just do a simple ratio at the end to kind of tidy things up. So right now we're making equal to 1, and 1 tick, remember, is 2 seconds. Okay, so next thing we're going to do is you can see if on the screen here that we're multiplying by 0.15. Now, why are we doing that? Well, because the meditation talent is the talent that allows us to regenerate 15% of our mana while casting. Now, this is the only way we regenerate mana while casting until we get the Priest Tier 2, right, in which that'll go up to 30% of our mana while casting. But right now, we only have the 15% from meditation. And so what that basically means is that we're taking 15% of that Spirit value Sorry about that. 15% of that spirit value. And that's going to be our casting. So that's going to be compared to the MP5 because that's the only portion of it that's going while casting. So we basically just solved this like a normal equation. I made spirit into x here just to make it more legible. We multiply the x over 4, right? And we get 0.15 over 4 equals 1. And remember that we have to keep the x here at all times. So when we divide by 0.15, right, the x remains, and sorry. So when we divide by 0.15 by 4, right, the x actually remains. So 0.15 divided by 4 equals 0.075, and then it's actually 0.075x. Okay, so it's 0.075x equal to 1, and then obviously it's just super easy to solve because we divide both sides by 0.075, right? And we just get x on the left side, and then on the right side we get 26.66. So 26.66 spirit per is 1 tick, essentially, right? And but MP5 is measured in 5-second intervals, right? Not 2. So all we have to do here is set up a ratio. So we have 2-second intervals, and then we're going to divide it by the 5-second interval, so it's 0.4, and then we multiply 0.4 by the spirit number, 26.66, and we get 10.66 spirit. So basically what this is saying is 1 MP5, right? So the base, like a tick for a tick 5 at the lowest possible regen, which is 1 MP5 that you can get from like an item, it takes 10.66 equivalent spirit to match that. Now keep in mind, remember again, this is while casting, right? So this is very useful information because it helps us basically determine that, when you compare these values, right, you'll basically notice that having most items at the start in phase 1 have I would say 2 to 5 MP5 on them, right? So just having the 2 to 5 MP5 on them is kind of like the equivalent of having 20 stat points of spirit on an item, or 60 stat points of spirit on an item, even 50. So that's kind of huge, right? But keep in mind, so you're going to look at that and you're going to be like, well, okay, every item that I get spirit on is going to be a suboptimal item, right? And that's not necessarily going to be the case because, like we said, spirit does other things. It's not just about the in-casting regen, but in a lot of cases, you are probably going to be chain casting in this game, so it is definitely something that's worth paying attention to, right? And you don't want to kind of get baited into over-focusing on spirit, I would say, at the start of the game. How spirit tends to work, in my opinion, as a stat, is that basically by the time you're kind of full geared from Molten Core, or full geared in phase 2 from Blackwing Lair, definitely, you end up with quite a respectable amount of spirit, and your gear just kind of starts naturally getting spirit on it. A lot of the pieces that tend to be good for you just have spirit on them, so you're not really going out of your way to chase spirit. And I think, as you can see from this formula right here, it doesn't really make sense to chase spirit, especially not in phase 1, because it's just you're going to be casting a lot, generally speaking, and you're just not getting a large effect or a percentage or portion of that regen in most cases, especially not if we're applying things to a fight-by-fight basis like we were talking about above. If we're talking about just surviving a boss encounter, then yeah, you're probably going to want to be casting and healing for most of that boss encounter, right? So you're not going to have a ton of time to just sit back and regen mana. You know what I mean? So something to keep in mind there. And then the last topic here, the last equivalence, and this one's going to be a bit controversial, but it's basically healing power versus int. And I have at the top the fallacious concept, every point counts. Now, I'm going to try and explain this first, and then we'll kind of go into trying to make an equivalence between healing power and int. So when I say every point counts, what you'll see when I start making the Pre-Bis guide, and I do that video next, is that you'll see some examples where I'm opting to choose Intellect over healing power, which tends to be like a big taboo, right? And one of the arguments that gets made quite often, is, well, every bit of healing power counts, right? And they're basically trying to say, like, well, if you justify dropping healing power here for int, then obviously you have to justify that for every other slot, right? And if you do that, you'll basically lose all your healing power. So you're saying, oh, I only lose 10, 15 healing power here and there. But in reality, when you start doing that on every piece of gear, now you basically have no healing power. And this is just like a logical fallacy, right? Because there's no reason that you have to drop healing power on every piece of gear, right? You can absolutely have a balance, but it's not really only that. It's that in this particular game, there's a lot of gear that is just flat out kind of like bis or good for a given class, and it does work the same way with healer to a large degree. So basically, you're kind of going to be getting a lot of healing power almost just passively from getting certain Pre-Bis items. A great example is like Briarwood Reed, right? There's just nothing else in that slot that's like better in phase 1. It's just by far the best item in terms of like Pre-Bis that you can get going into the raid in phase 1. So there's no like equivalent there for int, right? And then in other cases, like you just get so much healing power on gear with int, and in some cases there may be an option with higher int, but you're not going to drop like 40 healing power for a couple int or something crazy, or even 20 for like 1 to 2 int. So basically, you don't have to make these decisions in every gear slot, right? And there'll be some gear slots, and the gear slots you'll see when we make the other video, where in this particular slot, you're gaining probably a large value of intellect, and you're only dropping a relatively small amount of healing power, right? So that's kind of where this tends to make sense. And, you'll still have an ample amount of healing power. You won't have necessarily the maximum theoretical possible amount, but you'll still have a very high amount. You'll just have a lot more int. So just a word on that, and kind of explaining away that concept. So basically, how you can try and compare int versus healing power is you want to basically take the value of int that you're comparing, right? And you convert it to the mana value first. And then you go and find a heal that's basically like equivalent of that value, and kind of like see how much that actually heals for, right? And so I'll break it down like this, right? You have, let's do a 1.5 minute fight like I have here. So 1 minute, 30 seconds, 90 seconds total, okay? And let's say we're analyzing this through the lens of flash heal. So it's a 1.5 second heal. So basically, if you're spam casting, this is assuming spam casting flash heal, right? You get 60 casts of flash heal off during that fight. Already unrealistic, but that's okay. Because we want the comparison to generally like favor the healing power side, I would say. Like we want to be more generous to it. So we'll be generous to it here and say, 60 casts and you get all of them off. So flash heal has a coefficient of 0.4285. And if you don't know what a coefficient is, it's basically just like the amount that you have to multiply your healing power by for it to contribute to the base of that spell. So let's say there's like we're trying to analyze 20 healing here, right? So we're trading a value of intellect for 20 healing. So that we put that 20 healing through the coefficient, right? And we get 8.57 healing. So the 20 healing is making our flash heals heal 8.57 healing more per flash heal, right? and then we multiply that by 60 casts, and we get 514 healing, assuming chain casting, and there's not a drop of overhealing, right? Again, probably unrealistic, but we're being generous to the side of plus healing here, right? And so let's go find now an equivalent kind of mana cost, right? So let's say we're comparing the 20 healing to 15 int worth of mana, right? So what we'd do is we'd find a heal that's similar to 225 mana cost. And rank 4 flash heal turns out to be similar to 225 mana cost, right? And it's the same ratio, same nature of the heal, right? It's 215 mana cost. So let's see how much rank 4 flash heal heals. And when you look at the average, it basically averages out to 453 value at base. So you look at this and you'll be like, well, that just means the plus healing is better, right? Because it's basically like 60 more like healing points we got out of the plus healing. But it's not quite that simple, right? Because let's scroll down a little bit more. As we say here, we have to account for the rest of the plus healing that you'll have. And this kind of goes back up to the thing that we mentioned at the top. Because what people are going to start saying right now, or some people at least, is like, well, if you're making the sacrifice on every slot, then the amount of plus healing you'll have will be low. So we're not really gaining anything extra out of these heals. But like I said, some of these items are just going to be hard bis, and you're going to have at least 300 to 400 healing pretty much no matter which way you do your gear, especially if you're factoring in your 55 healing enchant from Molten Core that you'll eventually put on your weapon, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to assume the value of plus healing that you have like passively in the background is 300 healing, okay? And that's pretty generous because it's very easy to get over 400. Okay, but again, we want things to be super generous towards the plus healing side, right? And we want to give you the liberty where if you want to make multiple swaps in the favor of intellect over healing, then you'll still roughly have around 300 healing. That's basically what we're trying to say here. Like I said, you'll likely have 400 or so, like in the 400s. So what we have to do now is we have to add this value to the rank 4 flash heal, right? And we put the 300 healing through the coefficient. We get 128. We add that to the base 453, and we go to 581, right? And some of you might be asking, well, why would we not add like the coefficient, the plus healing value to the other value that we're doing, right? And it's because in the other one, what we're trying to figure out is the difference in that healing, right? So what we're basically saying in the first example is for every 20 points of healing that we're adding onto our character, Flash Heal is gaining 8.57 per cast, right? So that has nothing to, that is the coefficient value that we are putting it through the coefficient, essentially, right? But we're not putting the whole spell through the coefficient because the everything else is already part of the base, right? All we want is to compare that specific 20 extra points of healing that we're debating on using or not to the 15 points of healing that we're debating on using or not. Okay? And what we're saying is that, yeah, it gets us 8.57 healing, and you multiply that by 60 casts, so we get 514 healing. But if you instead use that 225 mana to just cast another heal, so you get another heal cast, right, from that intellect before you go then you're gaining more than that when you factor in the whole new heal you're going to cast. Now, this is not even counting if the heal is gonna crit. And with world buffs, you're going to have around 20-something% crit, okay? So this could actually be even higher in favor of the intellect, right? Now, granted, like I said, I would tell you the strengths and the weaknesses of this, right? This is assuming that you're using all your mana down to the last drop, right? And that you would have yourself if you hadn't had the intellect, essentially, right? Because the idea is that you're gaining a heal that you wouldn't have. So that is something to keep in mind. So it does depend on the nature of your run. But again, like I said, we're trying to target this towards kind of like the mid-tier guild, and we're trying to think of a scenario where like you're struggling to kill a boss and you're trying to make hard gearing decisions about what is best for that fight, and kind of like every little bit of mana matters. You know, like people are going maybe your raid damage is not very high, right? So you really need to kind of do your best to keep everybody alive. So these are the types of scenarios we're talking about here. Again, this is not going to apply in like a speedrunning scenario, right? There's a reason why when you look at the all the BIS guides, right, from people that are doing speedrunning, they all reflect what would be good in speedrunning, which is plus healing, because you're not mana remaxing in a speedrun, right? So you basically get no value from intellect at all. But in a one-off fight scenario, things change, as you can see here. Now, we did the calculation again with heal, which has a coefficient of 85%, right? So 0.85 times 20 is 17.142. And then we divide the 90-second fight by 2.5 seconds, which is the cast time for heal, and get 36. So you'll have 36 times 17.142, which is 617. And then rank 3 heal, which is, it's not as close in comparison, but it's like it doesn't work quite as well as it does up here, but it's close enough, right? It's 566 to 643 with an average of 604, right? And then what we can basically say is we, instead of calling this 15 healing, right, we'll just call it 17 healing, because every point of intellect is 15, so we'd be adding 30 points of intellect to 225, which we had before, right, to get 255 mana in order to make up the cost to cast this heal. So for 17 intellect, we're getting 604 healing base, but then we have to apply the 300 healing through the coefficient as well, right? So that ends up being 257. So we get 604 plus 257, which is 861. And as you can see, when we're using more efficient heals, we're getting even more of a benefit from the intellect here, right? From having more intellect. And this is a really good way that you can kind of give yourself an advantage if you make the appropriate substitutions in the correct slots. Again, we're not constantly subbing out every piece of plus healing for intellect. That would be absurd, right? Because in a lot of cases, you're giving up maybe 10, 15 plus healing for a couple int, and that's never worth it, right? But if you can give up, like I've seen some people, like they give up like literally like 15 int for like 14 plus healing or something, right? That's just insane. I've seen people give up on the Librams. This is actually a really good example. They give up 150 mana, right, for 8 plus healing, which is kind of insane when you think about it, right? So in these terms at least, right? Although to be honest, like in situations like that, I would probably always give up the 8. I would probably always give up the the 8 healing, just in more of like a generalist gear set, even if it's not completely BIS for a speed run that I was doing, because it's just so much better in every other scenario that it'd be absurd to to use the plus 8 there. So just some things to think about when we're going to be going into the Pre-Bis video, because that's how I'm going to be doing kind of like a lot of my analysis around this stuff. And yeah, I think it's very useful for the average player to kind of like realize, be cognizant, and know this stuff. And also, like, you'll start to see that some items that people think are really bad in this game actually aren't really that bad. It's just that they don't have explicit use in speedrunning, And a big culture on the P servers where a lot of this Bis stuff was created was speedrunning, right? Because the game is very easy, and the idea is people just want to min max and completely destroy the game. I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean like blast through it, and that's absolutely fine, obviously. But with these, these classic launches, these official classic launches, there's a lot of people that kind of just want to go on the game and play with their friends, and they're not trying to speedrun, and therefore some of the information that you're getting on the healing side is not totally accurate, and it's not inaccurate in a way where people are intentionally trying to mislead you or anything like that. Like, they're giving good information. The Bis guides are not bad for any of the healing things. It's just the role that they're assuming that you want to be in is maybe not correct, depending on kind of like what you want to do in the game, right? And that's fine. So that's why we'll come in here and we'll give you some alternative options, right? So thanks for watching, guys. I hope this made sense, and we'll get into the Pre-Bis and then the Molten Core stuff, and then we're going to talk about some of the fun stuff that they just announced, like the dual spec and stuff like that. So thank you guys for watching. Like, subscribe if this was helpful to you, and talk to you next time.